Welcome to this webinar, Asia Pacific as a Clinical Trial Powerhouse. This is Dr. Annie Siu, the Director of APAC Content from Citeline. This webinar is brought to you by Trialtrove's Whitepaper on the same topic. This presentation will be divided into 5 sections. We shall start with the introductions, followed by the scope of the analysis. Then we shall have an overview on the Asia-Pacific trial landscape, and then deep dive into the leading trial locations in APAC. Last but not least, we shall discuss what does the future hold for Asia-Pacific. Now, let's start with the introduction first. This presentation and the red paper are brought to you by Trialtrove. It is often said that disease knows no borders, but is the same true for clinical development? Patient availability is a critical component for clinical trials, and so it stands to reasons that clinical development should match the epidemiologies of the diseases. Of course, this is often not the case, with long-standing bias towards studies in the US and Europe, where healthcare infrastructures and the pharmaceutical market are generally more mature. However, change is underway. This white paper takes a deep dive into the clinical trial landscape in Asia-Pacific regions over the past decade, from 2012 to 2021. It shows that during this time period, Asia-Pacific has become a hotspot for clinical trials, with trial activity trending upwards and eventually contributing almost half of the entire global clinical trial activity in 2021. Interestingly, each Asia-Pacific location has its own driving forces and unique differentiators. Utilizing our clinical trial intelligent database, Trialtrove, this new analysis delve into the sponsors, diseases, and type of the trials across Asia-Pacific regions, and consider the factors shaping the present-day landscape in those Asia-Pacific locations with the highest overall trial activity. The author of the white paper are the Senior Director of Trialtrove, Andy Benson, and me. Following are the scope of the analysis. This analysis takes a deep dive into the trial landscape, clinical trial landscape in Asia-Pacific regions over the past decade, from 2012 to 2021. As we navigate through the data, it is important to note 3 things. Firstly, Trialtrove is focused on the trial activities, clinical trials, with a time perspective. Other types of studies, for example, those evaluating devices, surgical or behavioral intervention, or based on retrospective data, are not part of the analysis. Secondly, the trial start numbers are limited to those for which an actual trial start year is provided in the public domain. We excluded trials listed as planned and never confirmed to have started, or for which a specific actual start date was never disclosed. The number of recent years may also be impacted by delayed reporting of trial activities. Thirdly, we are considering the Asia-Pacific regions to consist of locations classified into Asia, Australia, Oceania trial regions in Trialtrove. Now, let's take a look at the rise of APAC. The x-axis of these figures shows the trial start year from 2012 to 2021. The y-axis shows the trial count over the period. The trial activity in Asia-Pacific has increased considerably over the past decade. The total number of Phase 1 and Phase 4 trials started in Asia-Pacific increased from 4,562 trials to 7,718 trials, with a compound annual growth rate of 5.4%. This growth is most prominent in recent years, in particularly since 2016. Now, let's take a look at the proportion of trials conducted in Asia-Pacific and rest of the world, respectively. The x-axis is the trial start years. The y-axis shows the percentage of global trials in Asia-Pacific or rest of the world. The light green line shows the percentage of global trials conducted in Asia Pacific increased from 13.6% to almost 15%. The dark green line shows the percentage of global trials conducted in the rest of the world decreased from 64% to almost 15% in the same reporting period. The total number of trials studied in the rest of the world decreased from 8,080 trials to almost 7,800 trials with a compound annual growth rate of minus 0.4%. Rest of the world trials are defined as studies that do not contain a trial site in an APAC location, although it is worth noting that a portion of APAC trials will also have sites in other regions. In other words, almost half of the clinical trials included a site in Asia Pacific by 2020. If this trend continues, Asia Pacific will surpass rest of the world as soon as next year. This recent transformation is remarkable, show that Asia Pacific is very much on the cutting edge of the clinical research. Now let's see where exactly is this growth in Asia Pacific happening. The x-axis shows the Asia Pacific trial locations. The y-axis shows the percentage of Asia Pacific trials in each locations. China has taken the lion's shares of the clinical activity over the past decade. 14.5% of Asia Pacific trials included a Chinese site, and therefore the countries take the top spot by a clear margin. China is followed by Japan in the second place, with 21% of trials included a site there. South Korea round out the top three with 13% of trials. Fourth place is taken by Australia, just slightly ahead of India in the fifth place with 11% and 10% of APAC trials, respectively. Notably, only 10% of Asia-Pacific trials included in the remaining 32 Asia-Pacific trial locations, where at least one study had been recorded in Trialtrove. In other words, this top five countries, and China in particular, dictate the overall dynamic within APAC. Now, let's take a look at the trial phases in Asia Pacific. The y-axis shows the percentage of APAC trials in phase 1 to phase 4. The light green area represents the percentage of the phase 1 trials. The purple area represents the percentage of phase 4 trials. As shown in these figures, the late stage phase 3 or phase 4 trials dominate in Asia Pacific from 2012 to 2016. But since then, early stage phase 1 and phase 2 trial or phase 2 trials have increased their share of total trial landscape. Notably, phase 1 trial increased from 627 trials to 2,464 trials with a compound annual growth rate of 14.7%, surpassed the compound annual growth rate of overall APAC trial 5.4% during the same reporting period. Phase 2 trials increased from 1,301 trials to 2,211 trials at a compound annual growth rate of 5.4%. The percentage of phase 2 trials in Asia Pacific remain constant at around 28%. The phase 3 and phase 4 trials increased with the compound annual growth rate of 2.6% and 0.5% respectively. To conclude, the overall growth in Asia Pacific trials is attributed to the increasing importance of early stage clinical trials. This is a result of higher level of innovation within APAC, with more drugs than ever being discovered by companies based in these regions. Our white paper on the clinical trial landscape in China, published last year, also shows how phase 1 trials are dominant in China specifically. This corresponds to China consolidating its position as the second leading location for R&D globally, with South Korea, Japan, and Australia also in the top 10, as per analysis in our latest pharma R&D annual review. Now let's take a look at the trends further. This figure shows the number of trials started in the top 5 locations. The x-axis and the y-axis shows the trial start years and the trial count, respectively. In China, the light green line increased from 1,113 trials with an impressive 4,751 trials with a compound annual growth rate of 15.4%. China surpassed Japan to become the leading trial location in Asia Pacific since 2014. Although trials in Japan, the dark green line, have decreased from 1,561 to 875 trials with a compound annual growth rate of minus 5.6%. The compound has maintained the second place since 2014, apart from a brief drop to the third in the 2020. The number of trials in South Korea, the light blue line, also decreased from 804 trials to 721 trials with a compound annual growth rate of minus 1.1%, and dropped from the 3rd place to the 5th place in the past decade. Australia and India both saw an increase in trials with a compound annual growth rate of 4.1% and 2.9% respectively in the same reporting periods. Notably, India briefly replaced Japan in the 2nd place in 2020, primarily due to the large number of trials for COVID-19 treatment which were initiated there. Consider the trial started in different therapeutic area over the past decade. Oncology, the green line, is the clear winner, increased from 1,118 trials to 2,319 trials, with 90 trials with a compound annual growth rate of 7.3%. It is unsurprised and mirrored the concentration of growth of pharma R&D for cancer observed globally. The number of trials, clinical trials for infectious disease, the purple line, doubled in the past decade, as shown here in the purple line, increased from 513 trials in 2012 to 1,318 trials in 2020, although there was then a slight decrease to 1,259 trials in 2021. Trials for infectious disease vaccine, the brown line, increased by nearly 4-fold in the same reporting period. It should be noticed that COVID-19 pandemic triggered a rapid rise in the number of infectious disease trials, both drugs and vaccine trials in 2020. In 2020 to 2021, over 15% of infectious disease trials for both the treatment and vaccine in Asia Pacific were targeting COVID-19, with 13.2 of them conducted in China and 13.1 in India. Now let's see the trend in the top APAC locations more specifically. This table shows the top 3 indications for each of the therapeutic areas. The bold purple color text highlight the unique disease found in each trial locations. In India, 5 diseases are making the top 3 in the other which is not making the top 3 in the other locations, which means the unique disease for India. For example, with trials for head and neck cancers and hepatitis vaccine, etc., all making an appearance only in these locations. Australia got 5 unique diseases. China and South Korea got 3. Japan got only 2 unique diseases. The intensity of the trial activity for some of these diseases reflect the regional epidemiologies. For example, head and neck cancer and hepatitis are common in India. Now, take a look at the sponsorship of those trials. This figures shows the percentage of industrial sponsored trials in each of the top 5 Asia Pacific APAC locations, which were sponsored by domestic or foreign entity over the past decade. In Japan, South Korea, and India, we see between 15.6% or 67% of trials being initiated by foreign sponsors. Australia's speed is striking, with 95% of trials initiated by foreign company. This high number of foreign sponsored trials speak to the comparatively lack of domestic company and attractiveness of Australia as a locations for foreign company. Scheme to attract investment include a generous R&D tax incentive, government supportive measures, experienced English-speaking clinical investigator, and acceptance of the Australian clinical data by the major regulatory agency. China stands out as the only major APAC location where domestically sponsored trials make up the majority. More than 3/4 of the trials in China were sponsored by the local Chinese company. Now, let's take a look at the trend in China more specifically. The light green line shows the Chinese trials sponsored by the domestic company. The dark green line shows those trials, Chinese trials sponsored by foreign entity. Digging deeper into the data, trials in China sponsored by domestic company increased year on year at a faster rate than those initiated by foreign multinational. The two groups shows the compound annual growth rate of 28.5% and 7.1% respectively over the past decade. A combination of factors are nurturing the Chinese extensive domestic growth in the pharma and biotech space. Firstly, the availability of the capital and talent. With the largest population in the world of more than 1.4 billion people, the countries provide not just huge market opportunity, but also a massive set of potential patients to enroll into clinical trials. Recent regulatory reform and policy changes have also helped to facilitate the development of innovative products. China's National Medical Product Administration has streamlined the clinical trials and drug approval process, including priority review, special review, as well as breakthrough therapy destination for innovative products that target the unmet medical need in China. The national reimbursement drug list also being updated more frequently and prioritize the entries of the newly approved novel drugs. Lastly, listing rule changes allowed pre-revenue, pre-product biotech company to be listed in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange or Shanghai Stock Exchange Science and Technology Innovative Block. Combined together, all of these factors can be seen as the rocket propellant for the growth. Now, take a look at those trials sponsored by the big pharma. In Citeline, each year we characterize a set of company as top 20 pharma using Script 100 ranking, which are based on drug sales. This figure shows the total number of trials sponsored by the top 20 farmer in APAC and against the compound annual growth rate. This y-axis shows the count of trials, number of trials sponsored by the top 20 farmer in APAC. This y-axis shows the compound annual growth rate. Japan is in the prime position with 3,615 trials and the compound annual growth rate of 1.6%. While Australia used to have a higher number of top 20 sponsored trials, the number is in slow decline. This is in contrast to China, where the top 20 are growing the number of trials and with a compound annual growth rate of 5.2%. Although the overall number are still way behind those in Japan at 1,811 trials. This accounts for just 7% of overall trial activity in China. It is interesting to follow these trends over the next few years to see whether they continue in the same direction. Now, let's take a look at the analysis for the Japan's trials more specifically. This y-axis shows the number of top 20 sponsored trials in APAC or Japan, and which represented by the light green bar chart or the dark green bar chart respectively. The purple line shows the percentage of APAC trials conducted in Japan, which are sponsored by the top 20 farmers. So it is clear that the top 20 farmers sponsored 913 free trials in Asia Pacific in 2012, the highest amount in the past decade. But by 2020, this number has reduced to just 698. However, the decline in the trial number across APAC was not mirrored in Japan, where the top 20 farmer utilization of Japanese site remains steady here, as shown in the dark green bar chart. On average, over the period, 14.6% of top 20 farmer-sponsored APAC trials were conducted in Japan. So it is shown that Japan's leading position is perhaps also unsurprised, given two of the top 20 farmers are headquartered in that countries, namely Takeda and Citeline. However, by excluding trials sponsored by this Japanese company, the remaining top 18 farmers still conduct 14.5% of APAC trials in Japan. This reinforced the fact that Japan is an attractive APAC trial location for big pharma in general, which can be attributed to Japan's excellent reputation and long history in the field. In addition to being the home of many long-established global pharmaceutical companies, Japan is also the only trial location in APAC that acts as the finding regulatory member and finding industry member of ICH. Now let's analyze the MRCT trials in APAC, the multi-regional trials. The y-axis here shows the count of the MRCT trials in APAC. This y-axis shows the compound annual growth rate. Across the APAC regions, Australia is the leading locations for MRCT trials. Over 4,000 MRCT have been conducted in Australia, represent almost 70% of trials in the country, and with a compound annual growth rate of 3.1% over the past decade. As a trial location, Australia is particularly attractive due to the streamlined regulatory framework, such as the Clinical Trials Notification Scheme. The data generated in Australian study are accepted by major regulatory agency. This, coupled with the close cultural and economic tie between Australia and Western countries, has led Australia to be an attractive location to include in global Emerald City for Western sponsors. Now, let's take a look at the first-in-human trials. This y-axis shows the count of the first-in-human trials. This y-axis shows the compound annual growth rate. Australia's reputation as a leading global destination for early stage phase clinical trial is well established, with a robust network of experienced specialized phase 1 sites. Australia is leading the Asia Pacific regions in the number of first-in-human trials, constituting 7% of total trials in Australia, and increased at a compound annual growth rate of over 15%. China is in the second place, and its number of first-in-human trials show an impressive compound annual growth rate of almost 13.5%. Although such first-in-human trial is just a minority at 1% of overall trial activity in China. Interestingly, Australia has also become a location of choice for certain domestic Chinese companies looking to develop their drugs internationally, to take their drugs into first-in-human trials and to help accelerate global clinical development timeline. Companies such as Beijing's Citeline, etc., amongst others, have used these strategies for some of their first-in-human trials. Now, let's take a look at those novel trial design. In more recent years, given the enormous cost of clinical trial development program, sponsors have been focused on finding ways to run clinical trials more efficiently and quickly. One common method for innovation is in clinical trial design, allowing multiple hypotheses to be tested within a single study. Such trials are created with a master protocol framework, allowing a single trials to achieve the objective that may otherwise require multiple separate trial and protocols. These figures evaluate the percentage of trials in major APAC locations which utilize various types of innovative design, namely those described as using master protocol or being adaptive, the light green line, as well as those explicitly described by the sponsor as being an umbrella trial, the dark green line, or the basket trials, the purple line. This and innovative trial design are mostly used in oncology, where basket trials test a drug using against multiple different tumor types with a common molecular biomarkers, while umbrella trials test multiple different target drugs against a single disease. Across the top 5 APAC locations, we see that South Korea has the highest percentage of umbrella trials and basket trials, as well as the second highest percentage of trials described as adaptive or using a master protocol. Clearly, this speaks to the attractiveness of South Korea as a trial location for a sponsor running these trials who have confidence in the ability of sites and investigators to perform well in those trials. These trials are challenging from the fact that genotype, phenotype, and their association can be hard to obtain in advance at the trial planning stage. South Korea benefits from the Korean Genome Project, a joint project by Harvard Medical School and the Russian National Institutes of Science and Technology and other companies and organizations. According to Citeline, 53% of umbrella or basket trials in South Korea were conducted by the University of Rusin College of Medicine during the reporting period. Across APAC as a whole, Roche was the sponsor with the most of this type of trials, with 24 umbrella or basket trials. 19 of those were conducted in South Korea. 17 of those were conducted in Rusin associated site. Now, let's take a look at those COVID-19 trials. The y-axis shows the percentage of COVID-19 trials in Asia Pacific. Although our analysis has looked back over a decade, it could be remiss to not briefly mention the impact that COVID-19 pandemic had on the global clinical development in the past few years. If we look at the number of clinical trials initiated across APAC for COVID-19, including both treatment and vaccine trials, we see China and India are almost neck and neck for the top spot in terms of the percentage of APAC's COVID-19 trials. Both are ahead of the other APAC location by a clear, significant margin, with Japan in the third place, followed by South Korea and Australia, which each contribute about 5% of COVID-19 trials in Asia Pacific. Now, let's further analyze the drug type for those trials, COVID-19 trials. The light green bar chart shows the percentage of APAC trials for COVID-19 treatment trials. The dark green bar chart shows the percentage of COVID-19 vaccine trials. The purple bar chart shows the percentage of natural product COVID-19 trials. So looking more closely into these trials, India lead the way for the COVID-19 treatment trials with 39% of Asia-Pacific COVID-19 trials, while China had the most vaccine trials started, 35%. Both countries invested significant resources into the development of vaccine and have world-class domestic vaccine research and production capability. So seeing them leading the way for vaccine in APAC is unsurprising. Additionally, in both locations, there are medical system using natural product in forms of Ayurveda in India, and natural in the traditional Chinese medicine in China. And when the pandemic occurred, sponsors rapidly begin testing natural products to see if they could be effective. For those natural product COVID-19 trials, 15% and 35% were conducted in India and China respectively. And they account for a significant portion of the COVID-19 treatment trials initiated in those countries. So as we have shown, the volume of the clinical development is generally increased across APAC, although there are location-specific differences. How do we think each of the top 5 APAC locations clinical trial landscape may change in the coming year? While we cannot predict the future, we are happy to offer some informed guess about where things may be headed. In China, we expect that the trend we have seen for growth will continue as both domestic Chinese pharmaceutical companies continues to expand and mature, and the foreign interest in running clinical trials in China increases. Turning to Japan, the picture is perhaps a little more uncertain given the number of clinical trials in Japan has actually been falling. One factor to consider is that after a decade of development, several Japanese companies have grown into truly large global pharmaceutical company. As such, they are often focused on multinational trials with broad geographic footprints to support drug registration in multiple locations. Additionally, they are well established engaged in running early stage trials in Western location. This global outlook may well have contributed to a downturn domestic activity. Secondly, foreign sponsors will naturally spread their APAC trial program across various locations, and the rise of China may have diverted some clinical activity away from Japan. Clearly, Japan will continue to be a key location for clinical development, and we look forward to seeing what the statistic for 2022 and beyond review. In South Korea, the growth rate in clinical trials may have been negative over the past decade, but the reduction was minor. This remains a dynamic and attractive location for clinical R&D with world-class clinical medical institutes and strong support, including the Korea National Enterprise for Clinical Trials Organization, which promotes the advancement of clinical trials. Additionally, the domestic South Korean biotech industry continues to grow, particularly in the areas such as cell therapy. We could be surprised if the clinical R&D did not grow in this marketplace in coming years, particularly for early phase trials. Regarding Australia, we believe it will continue to be a location of choice for Emerald City, with the expected continuous growth of Chinese clinical R&D and Australia being ideal place geographically for Chinese sponsors. We particularly expect to see growth in the number of Chinese sponsored trials in Australia. Which is less clear is whether we will see an expansion of domestic Australian trial activity, which is of course directly tied to the amount of domestic pharma and biotech research as well as the capital funding available. Efforts are underway to expand the industry, such as through the Medical Research Future Fund, which we watch with interest. Finally, we look to India, a location where the makeup of clinical trials differs from its geographic peers. In the past, domestic drug development in India has been mostly concentrated in generics, biosimilar, and vaccine space, as well as natural product, where the country has long established experience. However, India has many of the same characteristics as China when it comes to attractiveness for clinical development. Regulatory reform were introduced, and India has a large potential pool of a patient pool for sponsors to tap into. In pharma projects which track all drug development globally, including preclinical, it is interesting to note the first appearance of Indian company working in cutting-edge area, such as immuno-oncologies and CAR T therapies, with a renewed focus from government on the sector, including the right incentive for investment. We might be on the cusp of seeing a shift towards more innovative novel drugs and biotech R&D. For Asia Pacific, we have focused our analysis on the top 5 APAC location by overall trial volume. But in Trialtrove, there are more than 35 different APAC locations which are tracked, including some with very advanced healthcare system, as well as large populations. We believe APAC will continue to take an increasingly large share of global clinical activity, driven by top locations in the near term, but also with the potential, if we look further out into the future, for other APAC locations to rise in prominence on a global stage. That is the end of my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much.